For more than 2 decades, one man walked free, while an innocent husband carried the weight of a murder he never committed. Neighbors whispered about him. His wife's own relatives cut him out of their lives. And the police who were supposed to protect him spent 16 years convinced he was a killer, right up until the day he died, still fighting to clear his name. What none of them knew was that the real murderer had once sat at their family dinner table, laughed with their daughter, and walked out the front door every single time without anyone suspecting a thing. This is the story of how a devoted husband was wrongly branded a murderer, and how it finally took a piece of DNA, a bottle of water, and 2 detectives who refused to accept the easy answer to expose the truth. Leslie and Sandy built their life together starting in the early 1970s, settling into a warm and welcoming home in a quiet Maryland suburb. Anyone who spent time around them describes the same kind of household, the kind where the door was always open, where neighborhood kids wandered in and out freely, and where there always seemed to be enough food on the stove for one more person. Leslie was the one who made sure nobody left hungry. Sandy was the one cracking jokes and pulling people into conversation. When their daughter Lauren was born a few years into the marriage, she became the center of their world, raised in a home defined by warmth rather than tension. By the time Lauren reached adulthood, she had moved into her own place, just a short drive from the house she grew up in. Even with some distance between them, she and her mother stayed remarkably close, talking on the phone nearly every single morning like clockwork. It was a small ritual, but one that made Lauren feel connected to home no matter how her life changed. Nothing about early May of 2001 suggested that this ordinary closeness was about to be shattered. On the morning of May 2nd, Leslie failed to show up for work, which immediately struck her boss as strange. She wasn't the type to skip a shift without calling first. Worried, he reached out to Sandy, who told him that as far as he knew, Leslie should have already been at the office. Uneasy, the 2 men decided to drive over to the house together to check things out. What they found the moment they stepped inside stopped them cold. There was blood scattered through the kitchen, smeared across the back door, and pooled near the appliances. Neither man could make sense of what they were looking at, but they split up to search the house anyway, moving quickly from room to room, calling Leslie's name, hoping against hope that she would answer. Sandy went upstairs, while Leslie's boss checked the lower level, but neither of them located her. Rather than immediately grasping the severity of what they were seeing, Sandy tried to rationalize it, suggesting that maybe Leslie had simply fallen and hurt herself, and that she might be at a hospital being treated. He flipped through the phone book looking for a number, while Leslie's boss made the call that would bring police to the house. When officers arrived, guns raised out of standard caution, Sandy reportedly made a light-hearted comment about how serious they seemed, a reaction that would later strike investigators as deeply out of place given the circumstances. While police methodically worked through the home, Sandy suddenly seemed to remember something. He hadn't actually checked the bathroom during his earlier search. That single detail would end up haunting him for years. Inside that bathroom, officers discovered a scene of horror, blood on the floor, smeared in swirling patterns where somebody had clearly tried to wipe it away, an overturned lamp, a toppled end table. And behind the closed shower door, the body of Leslie, curled into the corner of the stall. When a detective walked out to deliver the news to Sandy directly, telling him plainly that his wife was dead, Sandy's reaction was almost eerily still. There was no collapse, no outburst, nothing that matched what officers expected from a husband learning his wife had just been murdered. That calm, controlled response would become one of the central reasons investigators zeroed in on him almost immediately. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Lauren had spent the morning trying to reach her mother by phone, with no luck. She didn't think much of it until she noticed a police car pulling into her driveway and saw her father stepping out alongside an officer. She remembers the moment breaking into slow motion, her father struggling to get the words out before finally telling her that her mother was gone. She ran to her room in disbelief, and in an instant, the life she had always known, one she describes as close to perfect, was gone with it. Investigators, as they do in most homicide cases, started by looking closely at the people nearest to the victim, and Sandy's unusual composure after hearing the news only deepened their suspicion. It didn't help that he hadn't called 911 himself, or that he had somehow missed his wife's body during his own search of the house just minutes before police discovered her. To detectives, both details felt less like coincidence and more like red flags. They also worked to rule out the possibility of a random crime, checking for similar burglaries or assaults in the surrounding area, but nothing matched. That absence of any comparable pattern nearby pushed investigators toward a theory that whoever did this knew the household well enough to understand Leslie's routine, to get inside without raising alarm, and to attempt a cleanup afterward, behavior that pointed to somebody familiar with the family rather than a random intruder. Just 2 days after Leslie's murder, Sandy was brought in for formal questioning. Detectives pressed him hard on his movements that morning, looking for cracks in his story. When they learned he had made a trip to the local dump that day, it only heightened their suspicion that he might have discarded evidence. To them, it looked less like an ordinary errand and more like the deliberate construction of an alibi. During that same interrogation, Sandy admitted that things between him and Leslie hadn't been perfect lately, that the marriage had been under strain. For investigators already suspicious of him, that admission reframed everything. What had looked from the outside like a picture-perfect marriage suddenly seemed far more complicated, and to detectives, far more like a motive. Then came another piece that seemed to seal their theory. The medical examiner's findings suggested Leslie may have died sometime the night before she was found, yet Sandy had told police she was alive and well when he left for work that morning. To investigators, that contradiction was impossible to reconcile with innocence. Confident they had their man, detectives asked Sandy to take a polygraph test. When the results came back indicating deception, it only confirmed what they already believed going in. From that point forward, in the eyes of the original investigators, Sandy Prieur was their killer. The only problem was that they had no murder weapon, no physical evidence directly tying him to the crime, and without a confession, they had no case strong enough for trial. Hoping to find something that would tip the scales, they even turned to Lauren, hoping she might unknowingly reveal something that could implicate her own father. Remarkably, even after the crime lab identified unidentified male DNA recovered from beneath Leslie's fingernails, evidence that pointed toward the presence of another person entirely, investigators didn't abandon their theory about Sandy. Instead, they simply adjusted it, speculating that he might have had an accomplice help him carry out the murder. Despite Sandy's continued insistence that he was innocent, and despite Lauren standing firmly behind her father, police refused to seriously entertain any other possibility. Lauren has said that even she had a fleeting moment of doubt, wondering if her father could really be capable of something so horrific, but she always came back to the same conclusion. He loved her mother too deeply, too completely, for any of it to be true. Still, that certainty didn't stop the outside world from treating Sandy as guilty. Some members of Leslie's own family sided with investigators, distancing themselves from him entirely. Under the crushing weight of suspicion, isolated from almost everyone except his daughter, Sandy lived the next 16 years as a man the world had already convicted without a trial. When he passed away, Lauren has said she believes it was heartbreak, as much as anything else, that finally took him. 4 years afterward, Leslie's case sat untouched, one more unsolved file gathering dust in the Montgomery County Police Department. That changed in 2022, when the case landed on the desks of Cold Case Unit detectives Tara Augustine and Allison DePoy. Both women had specifically pursued careers in cold case work because of cases exactly like this one, files that deserved a second look with fresh eyes rather than being filtered through the assumptions of the original investigation. Rather than picking up where the first detectives left off, Augustine and DePoy chose to start from an entirely different premise. What if Sandy had been innocent all along? When Augustine called Lauren to let her know the case was being reopened, Lauren describes the moment as almost impossible to process, a possibility she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. The detectives were honest with her from the start, explaining that new techniques were now available that simply hadn't existed when her mother was killed, but that reinvestigating a decades-old case would take real patience. That new technique was forensic genetic genealogy, a method that had advanced dramatically in the years since 2001. The unidentified male DNA recovered from under Leslie's fingernails had been carefully preserved in the case file all along, useless on its own without something to compare it to. But now it could be run against public genealogy databases, the same tools ordinary people use to research their own family trees. If investigators could find even a distant genetic relative in one of those databases, they could begin building outward, constructing family trees, and slowly narrowing down a pool of possible suspects. The work was tedious and often discouraging. Leads would seem promising only to dead end, forcing the detectives to start over from a different branch entirely. For more than a year, Augustine pursued every partial match she could find within the United States without success. Rather than giving up, she and Dupuy expanded their search internationally, and that decision finally broke the case open. Several strong matches pointed toward Eastern European ancestry, and within roughly 2 weeks of following that thread, they traced it back to a family originating in Romania, the Gliger family. The discovery hit even harder once the detectives realized the Gliger family had actually lived near the Preers around the time of the murder. More than that, a young man from that family, Eugene Gliger, had gone to high school with Lauren. Genetic genealogy, however, can only narrow a case down to a family tree, not point directly at a single individual. So the next step was clear. Detectives needed a confirmed DNA sample directly from Eugene, without tipping him off that he was now the prime suspect in a 23-year-old murder. As it turned out, Eugene and Lauren hadn't just been high school classmates. They had actually dated for roughly 5 years, close enough that Eugene had once been a regular presence at the Preer household, sharing meals that Leslie herself had cooked. Sandy, notably, had never fully trusted him, viewing him as a bad influence on his daughter. That distrust wasn't unfounded. During his teenage years, Eugene had been connected to several burglaries and other brushes with law enforcement, though he was never formally charged in any of them. One detail from that period stood out sharply to detectives once they revisited it. Eugene had been conspicuously absent from Leslie's funeral. At the time, Lauren had accepted his explanation that the loss was simply too painful for him to face. Looking back on it more than 20 years later, with fresh suspicion attached to his name, that absence read very differently. Before making any arrest, Augustine and Dupuy dug deep into Eugene's life as an adult, speaking with people who had known him well, including 2 former wives. One of those women had previously filed a protective order against him, describing a pattern of frightening, volatile behavior, including substance abuse, angry outbursts, verbal abuse, and moments where she said she genuinely feared for her safety. For detectives, that pattern reframed Eugene entirely. The image of a troubled but ultimately harmless teenager gave way to a portrait of a man capable of real violence. To secure the DNA sample they needed without alerting him, detectives orchestrated a quiet, carefully planned operation. On June 9, 2024, as Eugene returned to the country through Dulles International Airport, he was pulled aside during what appeared to be a routine screening. Inside a small room, bottles of water had been deliberately placed for him. He drank from one and discarded it, unaware that the bottle would give investigators exactly what they needed. Once the lab compared that sample to the unidentified DNA recovered from Leslie's fingernails decades earlier, the results were conclusive. It was a match. 9 days later, on June 18, 2024, a task force of U.S. Marshals waited outside Eugene's home in Washington, D.C. The moment he stepped outside, agents moved in and placed him under arrest, catching him completely off guard. Detectives brought him in for questioning almost immediately, though Eugene largely refused to explain himself in any meaningful way. With the case now solved, detectives had the difficult task of telling Lauren the truth. She had picked up the phone expecting an update, not the revelation that would upend her understanding of her own past. When Augustine gently told her to sit down and asked if she remembered someone named Eugene Gliger, Lauren says she genuinely could not process what she was hearing. The man responsible for her mother's murder was someone she had once loved, someone who had sat in her family's kitchen and eaten meals her mother had made for him, someone who had come frighteningly close to getting away with it entirely. Investigators were never able to get a full confession explaining Eugene's motive, but based on his history and the evidence gathered, they pieced together a likely scenario. Given his past pattern of burglaries and his familiarity with the layout of the Prier home, along with an assumption that the family had money, detectives believe Eugene entered the house that morning intending to steal, not to kill. What they believe happened next was that Leslie came home or was already inside and recognized him instantly. Knowing she could identify him, panic set in, and in a desperate, selfish attempt to avoid getting caught, he killed her. Investigators believe he then dragged her into the shower in a crude attempt to wash away any DNA evidence, a plan that ultimately failed and, 23 years later, became the very thing that caught him. On August 25, 2025, Lauren walked into a courtroom to face Eugene at his arraignment. It was the first time she had seen him since the days immediately following her mother's death, back when he had held her while she cried, never once suspecting he was the one responsible. This time, when she looked at him, he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. When the judge asked how he intended to plead, the answer stunned everyone present. Guilty. In that single word, more than 2 decades of suspicion, grief, and injustice finally lifted from Sandy's name. He had died years earlier still fighting to be believed, but his daughter lived to see the truth confirmed in a court of law, clearing him not just legally, but in the eyes of everyone who had once doubted him. Eugene Gliger was ultimately sentenced to 22 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, a resolution that finally allowed the surviving members of the Prier family to begin healing. Leslie Prier's case stands as more than just a murder finally solved after 23 years. It's a reminder of what can happen when investigators lock onto a theory too early and refuse to let it go, and of how much damage that certainty can inflict on an innocent person's life. It's also a testament to persistence, both from a daughter who never stopped believing in her father's innocence, and from 2 detectives who were willing to question everything the original case file assumed. Advances in forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, are increasingly proving that no case is ever truly unsolvable, no matter how many years pass. For families like the Priers, who spent decades being told there simply wasn't anything left to pursue, that possibility offers something they hadn't had in a very long time: real hope. Lauren has said she now believes both of her parents can finally rest in peace, knowing that after everything, the truth came out and justice, however delayed, was finally served.